Okay, so our next presentation, for our next presentation, we would like to welcome Alyssa Grossman, who is with the University of Liverpool. Her presentation is entitled The Memory Meal, A Taste of the Romanian Communist Past. Alyssa Grossman is a senior lecturer in culture, space and memory at the Department of Communication and Media at the University of Liverpool. As a social visual anthropologist and ethnographic filmmaker, her research examines sites and practices of cultural memory in everyday domestic and institutional contexts and uses experimental methods to challenge the boundaries between anthropology and contemporary art. And we'd like to welcome you up now.
Thanks to the organizers for coordinating this really fascinating symposium. And yeah, thanks to everybody for coming. As was stated in the introduction, my background, my field is social and visual anthropology. And it's interesting that just the previous presentation, I was really struck by how, to me, that seemed such an anthropological project in so many ways. And I'm just interested because I don't know that much about the field of architecture. So I'm just thinking, yeah, it's interesting to see what the overlaps that are there between the fields that I wasn't aware of before. But so this presentation is going to talk about a really old project that I've dug up from the archives that I worked on almost 20 years ago now. 15 years ago, that I was doing in my field work for my PhD research in Romania. And I was looking at, my research was focusing on everyday sites and practices of memory in the Romanian context of post-communist transition. So actually this talk is not really going to deal with refugees or migrants, but I guess if you're thinking about memory and kind of, the post-communist sort of transition period, I think a lot of Romanians after 1989 felt like they were a little bit in exile in a different kind, their whole system and culture and society changed in so many ways. So in a way, people were having to really adjust to being in a totally new space. I mean, it's very different to what a refugee has to go through. But anyway, that might be some parallel we can talk about. But so in my doctoral field work, this was in 2007, and this coincided with the year that Romania formally joined the EU. So there was a real shift at that point in how Romanians started viewing their communist past as they were kind of poised on the verge of facing a new, European future. So what I was interested in was how residents of Bucharest in particular were invoking memories in relation to this passage of time, in relation to the ongoing changes in their everyday lives, and what this might tell us about the ways in which people were thinking about and navigating the present, and also their thoughts about the future. There we go. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background context for this research, so you can have a clearer frame for understanding my talk once I get to the discussion about food and memory. So just as a little bit of sort of background, I'm sure all of you know 1989 marked the fall of the Iron Curtain, and this included the Romanian Revolution and the end of nearly 45 years of communist rule in the country, most of which was under the dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu. I first traveled to Romania in 1997, just as a tourist, actually, to begin with. And then I went back and lived there for 15 months as a Fulbright scholar a few years later, and then ended up going back and back again over the years. So that's where I ended up doing my PhD fieldwork. And during this period, from when I first started going there, that wasn't even a decade after the revolution until many years after that, I really noticed a distinct change in terms of how people were referring to and talking about their communist past. And it was really only at the kind of tail end of that window of time when I noticed that people starting to classify their understandings and their feelings about what went on before the revolution and during the revolution as memory. So up until a certain point, it was all sort of too close, and it wasn't. People didn't really see it as memory. It was too much still a part of their own everyday experiences to consider it really a part of the past. But as time passed, I could see that the kind of textures and people's accounts of the past were somehow changing. And this was in kind of subtle but really noticeable ways. And it made me start to wonder, what is it that pushes a thought or a set of feelings into the realm of memory rather than just being a set of thoughts or feelings about something that has happened. So in the first few years, immediately following the revolution in Romania, people were really focused on forgetting. They wanted to leave behind what happened in the past, the hardships, the censorship, the political repression, the scarcity of food and resources, all of these things that they had been living with for so long. And in particular, the 1980s, which was the decade leading up to the revolution in Romania, it was an extremely harsh and difficult period. Ceausescu, as you might know, his regime was really extremely repressive. He was mainly focused on paying off all of the country's foreign debts, meaning that so what he did was most of the local products were sent abroad, were sold rather than used for the Romanian citizens. Energy and resources were really restricted to save money, or that was the line that he gave everybody. So people faced regular shortages of electricity, of heat, even through the really cold winter months. And food was also rationed, severely rationed. So people had really limited access to basic supplies like flour and sugar and oil and eggs, things like that. Exports like oranges and bananas were completely rare, really highly coveted. But even just for basic supplies, people would have to stand for hours, sometimes even days, in queues outside of shops to secure what little was available. So this was the kind of the context that people were coming out of during communism. So immediately after this all ended, after the revolution, people were generally happy to leave this past behind, to just embrace capitalism in all its glory, right? Or their idea of what capitalism should be, and to live a really different life from what they had endured for so long. But it did take some time before, changes could manifest in everyday life. There were traces and reminders of Ceausescu's atrocities all over the city. So you have monuments like the Palace of the People, which is now where the Romanian parliament is housed. It's one of the largest buildings in the world. It was simply too big to remove. Ceausescu demolished a section of the city of Bucharest that's the size of Venice to build this whole kind of complex, right? And people were kicked out of their houses. Everything was demolished and destroyed in this neighborhood. So this is like an enduring reminder of the previous regime right in the middle of the city. It took some time for the faces of the streets to change, but you could still find things like the old-fashioned lettering of communist shop fronts and vitrines speckled around the city, or the kind of dirty cement communist block style buildings that dominated the Bucharest skyline. Those were all kind of there, continued to be part of the landscape of Bucharest after the revolution. But as time went by and the kind of material remnants of communism started to fade, more and more people started evoking the past, right? It wasn't sort of all around them anymore. So they started bringing it up in their daily life, and little bits of kind of, I started hearing, funny stories about communism, or bits of longing and nostalgia in ways that I hadn't heard before. These kinds of things just started coming to the surface of ordinary conversations. So people were remembering about, not just the hardships, but about the strong bonds and friendships that they formed during this period, how they had to rely on each other, how people were there for each other. And now they were kind of regretting the absence of this in this capitalist society where everybody was, is much more individualistic and people didn't rely on each other as much anymore. So this started kind of bringing out more nuanced kind of accounts about the past, the communist past. So by 2007, I started hearing a lot of talk about, then versus now. With the 1989 revolution becoming increasingly referred to as this dividing line marking everyone's lives. So more people were talking about back then, life seemed to flow at a much slower pace. Everyone wasn't always in a hurry to keep up with the pressures of living in this free market system. Or even people started talking about the fact that the communist government, even though there were lots of things they could fault it for, at least it provided everyone with a house and a job, vacations every year, homelessness, unemployment, those kinds of things didn't exist. And I started having my interlocutors start, take out their old photo albums and show me how beautiful the streets of Bucharest used to be in the good old days. So you could really see this kind of discourse around memory starting to shift. This isn't to say that these, nostalgic impressions weren't biased or selective, but, they, at that point in time, they were just starting to become a bit more complex and nuanced than they were immediately kind of after the revolution. And this was, probably due also to the passage of time, because nearly 20 years had passed. This is sort of larger part of a generation, as well as, the way that the material landscapes and the kind of physical culture, the tangible material culture, people's everyday lives was changing, and becoming more and more like the so-called West, on a very visual level. It was also affected by the political landscapes at the time. The new leaders in Romanian government started really distancing themselves from Ceausescu's legacy publicly and kind of condemning the earlier communist regimes. Particularly, this was at a time, again, when Romania was about to join the EU. So there was a lot of talk around, how do we sort of demonstrate in a very public way our separation from the communist past on a political level. So leading up to Romania's accession to the EU in 2007, the president at the time, Traian Băsescu, he was making these very strenuous efforts. This is him in those two billboards here, to align himself with the West, to publicly distance himself from other Romanian politicians who everybody knew were sort of had been part of the former communist regime, and continued to hold political roles in the government even after the fall of Ceausescu. So in 2007, Băsescu, he made a very controversial public statement condemning the communist past, calling it repressive and totalitarian and terrorizing. He described the people who lived through it as victims, as martyrs, and he denounced it formally as an illegitimate and criminal regime. And then after this, there was a backlash from the government because many of them consisted of former communist leaders. There's a joke in Romania saying, we have the same people in government, they're all just wearing different hats, basically. Băsescu was actually impeached in 2007, and then there was this national referendum to vote on whether or not to dismiss him, which failed. So he continued to present himself as kind of fighting against corruption, and breaking from the communist legacy. So I'm going into all these details. It's a lot of information, but I just wanted to kind of paint a picture of how the context in Romania at the time was pointing to how people's confrontations with with the past, nearly 20 years after the revolution, were kind of starting to fall into this realm that could be conceptualized as memory. And this led me to want to study these processes and find out more about how they were operating. How are these memories undergoing transformations and revisions over time? How are they surfacing in new ways through the context of everyday life? And I was looking at, discourses and objects and landscapes and cultural outputs and forms of media and all those kinds of things. So during my fieldwork in Bucharest that year, I couldn't help but notice that talk about the past tended to involve animated discussions about food. And this was entirely unprompted by me as a researcher. I didn't set out to investigate food or to, its relationship to memory, but this was something that emerged in the course of my fieldwork. So not only was food itself the topic of conversation, but also the social context surrounding its acquisition, its consumption during communist times, how people would queue for hours at local shops, the kind of really delicate webs of personal connection that people would have to establish to require really scarce items, bribery, knowing the right people, all those kinds of things. People talked about the recipes that they would improvise to create a kind of semblance of normality in their lives because a lot of the ingredients weren't available. Certain foods that became commonplace in Romania after the revolution used to be considered a luxury, and people started reflecting about all those kinds of things. So as a visual anthropologist, I knew about the practice of what is called visual elicitation. And this is the practice of using like photographs or other visual media to stimulate responses in your interlocutors. So I decided I would try to use a similar model to provoke memories of this food-related past through a process of what I came to refer to as gustatory elicitation. So I decided to organize what I call the memory meal, which is masa amintirilor in Romanian. This is the invitation I sent out. So I invited a group of friends and colleagues to my flat, requesting each person to bring a food or drink that they associated with the period before 1989. So I was thinking, I hoped that this kind of event would evoke, individual memories, collective memories, and stories, and also then allow me to participate as much as I could in a past that I hadn't gone through myself. I'm from the US, I'm not Romanian. I learned to speak Romanian, I spent a lot of time there, but I didn't experience the communist past myself. So just as some visual anthropologists argue that tactile or embodied qualities of visual knowledge might encourage a deeper understanding of social experience, I hoped that gaining this kind of new gustatory knowledge could provide me with a more complex understanding of people's memories, and particularly people's affective taste memories. So I invited about 30 people to my memory meal. Most of them had been born in the 1960s and 70s, so at the time they were kind of in their 30s and 40s. They seemed more enthusiastic about the event than I had anticipated. Many were really surprised and pleased that so many foods from the communist era were still available in the stores today. So people kind of crowded in, unloading their sacks of food, comparing their finds, and they unpacked things like Turkish delight, biscuits, packets of breadsticks, powdered dried mashed potato mix in a box, rum-flavored chocolate bars, rings of hard pretzels strung on pieces of wire, puffed rice coated with pink and blue and yellow candy flavoring, bags of instant powdered coffee, glucose candy bars, fish paste in toothpaste-shaped tubes, sunflower seeds, a bottle of syrup to be mixed with sparkling water for homemade soda, tiny tins of tomato paste, packages of prawn crackers, which expand like big curls of polystyrene when you drop them into hot oil, parizer, which is a type of bologna made from a mixture of kind of unidentified meats. So I sampled as many things as I could. I listened to the stories and the jokes circulating around the room. I also tried to capture some people's reactions on film. The event really was, there was this atmosphere of kind of a mixture of nostalgia, disbelief, also some bitterness, also delight. It was an interesting mixture of emotions. And so there was, a general agreement about how terrible the food used to be, but this perception was kind of laced with a certain fondness. One person told me, younger people who lived through communism have a lot of positive feelings about those days because they were part of our childhood, and there's something magical about that time and the associations you have with it. We didn't have to worry like our parents did about getting enough to eat or surviving in basic material ways. So we're left with mostly nice memories. And several people approached me during the evening, which lasted until about 3 a.m. and they thanked me for organizing this gathering because that gave them a chance to reminisce about, and re-experience parts of their childhood. So a lot of the foods that people brought were kind of sweets and chocolates and other childhood treats. But there were also other things as well. Someone was frying up the prawn crackers in my kitchen, and he recounted to me how people used to order these in restaurants because oftentimes it was the only thing you could find in the menu. Somebody else then thought of a joke that was common during communist times about how when a queue would form in front of a shop, people would just line up automatically without even knowing what it was for, or without even wanting to ask because they knew it was, important. It had to be for something they needed. So these kinds of remarks and stories inevitably led to other jokes and stories about cues or the recipes people concocted from whatever ingredients happened to be available. One person was pondering this kind of inversion of perceptions that seemed to be occurring that evening during the memory meal, because they were saying before 1989, many people thought that food that was available during communism was a kind of poor substitute for Western, proper, normal Western foods. But now, when they were tasked with finding these items of food to bring to the memory meal, they realized that what they were finding in the shops then was kind of a poor substitute for the real products from communist times. One woman who brought a can of tinned pineapple recounted how this item used to be referred to as capitalist because it was so coveted and hard to find. But now bringing this capitalist item to the memory meal made her kind of associate it with communism in a very different way, or at least her own communist past. At one point, someone found the fuse box in my apartment and cut the electricity. The room went completely dark, and for about 5 minutes in the blackness, people were excitingly kind of recalling how when Ceausescu used to cut back on power and they would have to study by candlelight or lamplight. One person called out to me, "Hey, imperialist, do you have a candle?" When I said no, someone else said, "Of course, why should she be in the habit of hoarding candles like we were?" So people reminisced about these regular electricity shortages, the water shortages. They talked about how the best time to take a bath or to wash your dishes would be in the evening when the popular American soap opera Dallas was on TV, because everybody would be glued to their television sets and there would be less demand for water then. But then they were talking about, well, Dallas was one of the few American programs that they had access to and that Romanians really enjoyed watching, maybe because, it gave them a glimpse into the lives of, capitalist millionaires, which was so far from their own reality. People actually preferred to miss out on the water rather than miss out on one of the episodes. So these kinds of moments are what I ended up writing about, served as examples of episodic memory or embodied recollection, right, as opposed to semantic memory or intellectual recall. So when we talk about episodic memory, this is about personal, sensory memories connected to the body, and it underlines all other forms of memory, and it recalls its object through actual experiences or images and sounds, rather than like symbols or words or cognitive representations. So this type of memory has a really physical aspect, and it's kind of sedimented in individuals and communities through these bodily practices. So through this kind of stimulus of taste and smell and kind of the physical process of eating, the memory meal offered people a chance to really bodily experience other parts of their past. And then it was an opportunity for me as a researcher to kind of participate in this collective rekindling of the past beyond a kind of, a survey or an interview, but beyond a kind of cognitive or intellectual, level alone. So one participant also commented that, not only food itself, but also the physical shared spaces of eating are connected, and this has been mentioned already, are connected to, remembered social and political situations. So these very ordinary areas of food preparation and consumption can be viewed as these social landscapes of everyday life that reveal, really interesting things about cultural myths and about politics. It's also common knowledge that during communism, kitchens served as everyday meeting spots for political debates and analysis, where people were less likely to be bugged by microphones, where they could gather and talk about things that they wouldn't, that they didn't necessarily, that were a bit dangerous to talk about politically. So this memory meal evening turned out to be a real catalyst for discussions about all of these kinds of issues. And it sort of wound down, as I said, 3 a.m, with a handful of people gathered outside my kitchen, reading out the names of radio and television programs that were listed in an old newspaper from 1987 that one of my friends had brought to the event. And he brought these newspapers. He'd actually saved them unintentionally because they were stuffed into the window frames of his house the year that the Bucharest Metro was extended to his neighborhood. And so they stuffed the newspapers in the windows to keep them from rattling as the trains went by. And then, decades later, he still had these newspapers. So people were looking at the TV programming and just cracking up at the fact that there were only 3 radio stations during the time, 2 television channels back then. And it was basically, 2 hours of propaganda filled news broadcasts every evening, and that was it. So the memory meal participants acknowledged the mechanisms of repression experienced under Ceausescu. There was no kind of skimming over that, but they also showed how they were really active agents that continued to challenge and creatively interpret this past. So when I step back and look at this event, it was targeted at a kind of limited group of people. They were mostly urban, educated people of a certain generation in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. But their responses were broadly representative of their own generation and social status. And while members of this generation did hold certain memories in common, they also had their own stocks of private individual memories. So, that varied from person to person. So it was not about, rejection and condemning the communist regime, or about sort of blindly praising it and being nostalgic for it. It was really a mixture of kind of positive and negative and sometimes contradictory or even inconsistent impressions about the past, which really reflected this multiplicity of ways in which people were, appropriating and internalizing and sort of processing their memories. So the responses that I sort of that generated through this event pointed to this real complexity of people's memories of everyday life at that moment in time. And they really, what I noticed at that time was it really demonstrated a much more nuanced version of the past than the stories that were starting to surface in, say, the media, or an official remembrance rhetoric in politics. And other kind of cultural discourses, which were really much more kind of black and white, like either condemning the regime and saying everybody was a victim, or kind of looking at it as this very nostalgic kind of positive time. I think, yes, that's it. So thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Alyssa. I'll ask some questions in a minute, but I just thought it was, from our point of view, that idea of memory needing time and separation, and that separation to reflect. And I just kind of felt that, you're talking about what do you leave behind alongside what do you embrace for the future. And I think that was something that really did come out in what we participated in on Monday. We had people in the room that did that actually, that were at the workshop. And I think that it was, what was kind of lovely was we had a participant from Bolivia who brought some Inca food, which was dehydrated potatoes. And that's when people got really animated, because it was, even though they had no memory of that particular cultural object, it was something that could spark a memory that they could then possess as their own, which I felt was really lovely. And the other animated, you said people became really animated at the discussion of food, and we had that definitely in the room about who made the best type of rice, or who, and I think so I thank you for raising those points of, kind of episodic memory. I think that was super. And I think we've got some questions.
I have a question actually. Yeah. My PhD was on production of public space, so a little bit shifted from the production of public space in the early Republican period in Turkey. So when the regime changed, what happened in the cityscape in public space was they erased all the remnants from the Ottoman Empire actually, and they set up a new urban topology, and which had a big impact in public space and everyday life of public space actually, even if it was prescribed how to dress or how to speak, which language to talk, which nation to have, it was very prescribed. So
what year was that?
It was when the Republic was established, 1923. So it's like they established the secular regime. So I was wondering if what impact had the change in regime in the country. How did it impact the public space in your observations? A little bit more shifting from the, and I think because you state kitchen as a cultural memory, which is also political. So how do you think that impacts the cityscape? Maybe not directly, but indirectly, or the change of regime, the change of the use of kitchen, the change of having the food, the goods, and then how that impacted the public space. I just wondered a lot.
Okay.
Because you also live there. It was a very long period.
Yeah. How do I get back to the people who are online?
I think if you just go to, if you just close, we can just, if you
Close that.
close, sorry. If you close this.
Close it.
And then if you go to team.
There we go.
Yeah, so this one. And then stop shit. Stop the other shit.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It just made me think, I mean, obviously it played out differently throughout the country in different regions, but when I think about Bucharest, there was right before the revolution in the 80s, in the late 80s, Ceausescu started building these huge communal eating places in public, and they were covered by domes. They were called, what are they called? Circle, like
Like a public dining area.
a public dining area, basically, to kind of emulate what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time. These kind of huge, and they were shaped like a dome, and they were and the idea was that once they got finished, their construction was finished, families would no longer eat in their own private kitchens. They would all eat in this kind of public space, and it would be part of the communist, family or whatever. So they weren't completed. There were, I don't know, 3 or 4 of them that were being built at the time. They didn't get completed by the time the revolution came along. And then after '89, they were left in like ruins for several years, maybe a couple decades, and then they started building shopping malls out of them.
Yeah.
And so they became these domes, because they couldn't get rid of the actual structure, just turned into this, capitalist center of commerce and kind of materials, all these places where people were going to buy their Western goods and everything. It was like an inverse, a reversal of what they were originally intended for. But they were still there, and there were still these kind of huge physical reminders of the regime, but they completely transformed their, purpose in the landscape.
Did it also impact the urban toponymy, like street names?
So street names were also
How
changed.
did they do it? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, some street names were changed. Others were left. There was, it was less, in Bucharest there was less renaming, although if there were streets named specifically after communist officials, those were generally changed. And some streets in different cities were named like, Boulevard 29 December 1989, after the day of the revolution.
Very similar to Turkish story.
Yeah. So there was, and then the biggest thing really was the kind of demolitions that were, because people wanted to erase the visual signs of kind of communist, like shop window vitrines and buildings and kind of, the blocks, the sort of typical communist block structures. So yeah, I ended up actually photographing, because I noticed these vitrines that were all around the city that were usually like, very old-fashioned. They usually had like lace curtains, plants. The items in the vitrine were kind of arranged in particular ways that often had nothing to do with what the shop was actually selling. So sometimes it would be for like shoe stores or stores that sold hats or whatever. But they were this like really distinct kind of aesthetic. And I started photographing them because I noticed that they were disappearing and that they were, being taken, removed, and these new kind of like PVC windows were put in instead, and people wanted to be all modern and everything. But I love these old-fashioned vitrines. So I just, whenever I saw them, I started photographing them, and I realized, because at a certain point they were sort of this sign of the past, So that was like a kind of visual transformation on the streets that I observed over time as well. So there were lots of things. Yeah, the spaces of the city were really affected by.
It's very interesting to see how ideological changes affect in its scale. So
Yeah.
kitchen from public space.
Exactly.
The impact.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Did you get any sense of, that's all the places around Bucharest, and I imagine all the other major conurbations in Romania were similar.
Yeah.
Did you get any sense that the rural communities were happier
Yeah.
or
No.
less happy
Yeah.
under both systems?
It's so hard to generalize.
Were
but
they treated any differently? What I'm saying.
treated any differently during communism?
Well, under both.
Yeah, under both regimes. I did travel. I spent some time in various rural communities, and I think it was a mixture. Some people felt, because they were all forced to collectivize, so farmers had to give up their land, and then they had to join these collectives that were state-run, and that people resented that. The peasants were.
What happens to their produce during the Soviet time?
the government basically monitored and regulated it and basically said you have to produce this X amount, you have to give it to us, you know, took all the profits or whatever, and it wasn't, but at the same time, that employed everybody, it kind of ran the system where everybody was kind of taken care of, and then suddenly after '89, some people didn't have jobs, and so they felt a big, it was really scary, especially I think people who were of retirement age, they really resented that and felt very abandoned and lost. So I think it was also a generational thing. So the younger people tended to be, you know, able to accept things and roll with it, whereas the older people in the kind of more rural areas had fewer means to deal with the transitions. So it's quite complicated. Yeah.
Kind of answers it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Two things. First, I was in Bucharest in 2006 as an advisor to the EU.
Oh.
I was an EU advisor to Romania as to how do they transition. That is a 3-week-long lecture on the bizarreness of those conversations.
I can imagine.
My first week, I was on my own. I arrived at the airport. Someone greeted me and said, "Oh, I'm just on my fortnight's holiday. This is the person who's supposed to be embedding me with him." And they disappeared. Just sent me off to a hotel in the middle of a transport strike. So everyone drove in from outside into the centre, parked the cars absolutely anywhere and gridlocked the place.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating to walk around the city like that in transition.
Yeah.
And the first thing I want to do in every place I go to is eat locally and understand local cuisine. And I could not find any anywhere at all. It was all Western, Chinese, Indian. It was anything but Romanian food. And I think you just answered the question there. If a country's so impoverished, you can't run restaurants, so therefore there's just no foundation to that to work on. And that was quite interesting and eye-opening, because the take on what Western food was as well wasn't great either at that time. So I understand the powdered mashed potato. It's a bit odd. But my question is, I'm writing at the moment about memory, and I'm most interested in perpetual, what can you call it, perpetual present. So for some people, things aren't memory, they're triggered by stuff which they then relive. It's like a traumascape type thing. I know from readings around Russia through the same falling of the Iron Curtain, that a lot of people embrace the West. They got on with things, and the previous USSR became a memory, they remembered things from it. But many millions of people, because of those sorts of things, like they lost their employment, their identity and everything else. They don't have memories. Did that sort of thing happen in Romania and Bucharest as well? Is there a traumatised population there as well that doesn't have things in memory, but are still traumatised?
That they don't have memories, what do you mean?
Of the past. So they don't, as you describe, some people remember this about the past. Others are so traumatised that it's their perpetual present still. When something comes up, it becomes a re-traumatising.
I haven't really spoken with people in that situation. I'm sure there are people who were like imprisoned or who were basically seen as political dissidents who were treated really badly by the regime, and they're probably going through an entirely different process of memory and kind of confronting the past in a different way. But yeah, that wasn't sort of.
But not ordinary citizens.
Sorry.
Not ordinary citizens.
Yeah, no, I didn't know. And that was surprising, because I think the stories we get in the West is like, oh, people were terrified and they lived in this kind of constant state of, suffering. And what people actually tried to reinforce to me was like, well, yeah, it was hard, but we actually still had normal lives and we tried to make do. And we, it's almost like it's a bit, be like patronizing to say, oh, well, you did, that part of your life just doesn't count, because they experienced things just like the rest of us, but it was obvious, there were other certain challenges that they had that, and they didn't want to be seen as sort of, I don't know, like that their experiences didn't count, So
there were people who suffered greatly and who were traumatized, but people also wanted me to know that like they had, their lives, like they had parties and they fell in love and they had tragedies, like everything that normal people go through in their daily lives, that was still happening to them.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's definitely, those are the kinds of stories, the extreme ones that tend to get more publicity and get sort of the messages, the press picks up on those kinds of things, and the kind of more everyday, mundane stories of everyday life tend to stay under the radar, I guess. So.
Probably having less oppressive regime in this country. The working classes were held up back in the day.
Yeah.
I grew up in that post-war period.
Yeah.
And talking about cooking, I learned my cooking skills, if you want to call them that, from my grandmother, who brought me up. And they lived like pre-war and through the war and rationed. In fact, it ended in 1954 when I was born. And they really went through it. My man knew how to cook.
Yeah.
You give her a cupboard full of stuff, totally disconnected, she'd make her a plate.
Yeah.
And I carry that on now, so I come at this from a slightly different perspective, not being, being an indigenous. But yeah, things weren't easy for the British proletariat, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Just want to sling that in.
Yeah. No, it's. Were you in the presentation? Were you in the workshop on Monday?
Yeah.
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 Interesting.
Thank you so much, Alyssa.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.